Hi, in this lecture you will learn how to use the new and old qualifiers in row-level triggers. New and old qualifiers are used in row-level triggers. Yes, I said row-level triggers because these qualifiers are used within the row-level triggers only. As you remember from the previous lectures, statement-level triggers are not concerned with the rows. I mean the data in the table or view. They concern only the statement, if they are executed or not. They work once for the statement. So they don't know the data changes of the table or view of that statement. On the other hand, row-level triggers concern the rows and their values. And in Oracle database, row-level triggers can reach to the old and new values of the columns within the records that declared and maintained by the server itself. So how? Old.column name returns the old value of the column and new.column name returns the new value of the column. For example, let's say you updated a salary from 500 to 1000. If you want to reach the old value of the column, you use the old prefix with the column before it and then you write the column name. And for the new value, you write new with a column before it and the column name. So how can you reach to it? Old and new values of the columns are stored in two different records implicitly by the Oracle server. Actually, as I said before, it is maintained by the server automatically. When a row level trigger is executed, each row is stored into two different records created by the person row type attribute of the base table or view. You can reach to them with the old and new qualifiers. Actually, I said old and new, but as you remember from the previous lectures, you can assign some aliases for these qualifiers and reach to them with the new names. You will see that on the example soon. However, you cannot reach to the old and new values every time. As you can see in the table here, if a row is inserted to a table or view, the old values are null. Because since this is an insert, there is no old value. But if it is an update, that means we change the value of an existing row, so this row has its old status in a record and the new status in another record. But unlike a standard record, we use it with the old and new qualifiers with columns or its aliases. And if it is a delete operation, since the row is deleted, there are no new values. So the new values are null, but old values are stored into a record and we can use them with the old qualifier. We use old and new qualifiers to reach the columns. Actually, you cannot use the column names alone in the row level triggers. You need to write the old or new qualifiers before it. Since there are two timings for the triggers, you may get confused about the value of old and new ones. Instead of trying to explain abstractly here, I will show them to you on the examples. We can use old and new qualifiers in an SQL query in your trigger or in a plsql statement. As you know, we use old and new qualifiers with the columns. Normally, we cannot use a column within a plsql code directly. We use columns within the SQL statements. But with the old and new qualifiers, we can directly use them and even assign new values to the columns easily. We will see that on the examples more clear. Row level triggers may decrease the performance of your code if so many inserts, updates or deletes occur. We know that row level triggers run for each row that affected from that DML operation. So it needs more precise time and this will decrease the performance. So if you don't have to use it, you can use the statement level triggers instead. Of course, you may have to use it, so you will use it in so many times. But if your business does not need to run for each row, use statement level triggers instead for the performance. Column prefix before the old and new qualifiers are not used in the when condition. You will see the when restricting condition in the next lectures. And we'll see that if you use a column in there with the new and old qualifiers, you don't write colon sign before them. You will see that. So let's use them. All right, now we can start making our examples. So let's open up the SQL developer. At first, we will modify our previous examples to see the old and new values of the columns. Then we will make a real-world example. But first, let's disable all the triggers of the employees copy table to focus on only the triggers that we will operate on. All the triggers of a table can be disabled with a single line code. Let me show you. Alter table, employees copy, disable all triggers. Let's run it. Great. To see that better, let's refresh the triggers branch here. As you can see, all the triggers of the employees copy table are turned to gray here. These green ones belong to another table. So now let's open up our before row trigger and modify it. Let's simply print the new and old values of the salary column. Let me copy that and paste in here and write the salary of employee and concatenate that with the old.employee ID and concatenate that again, and let's write something like that, before, and concatenate that with the old.salary and again concatenate and write after and new.salary. All right, now let's compile it. Great, we have compiled successfully. Now let's refresh our triggers. As you can see, as soon as we compiled it, it turned to enabled status. Great, now let's test it. Let's write update employees copy set salary is equal to salary plus, let's say, 100, and again where department ID is equal to, let's say, 30. Now let's run it. As you can see in the output, we could get the values before the update occurred with the column old prefix and the column name, and the values after the update with the column new prefix and the column names. It's so simple. Now let's simply copy that text and paste to the other ones and see if they can also see the old and new values or not. Let's start with the after row trigger. Before compiling that, let's make before trigger disabled to understand the new ones easier. We can easily disable or enable a trigger with using the SQL Developer tool. We simply right-click on the trigger name on the Connections tab and click on Disable option here. And then click Apply in the opening window. Okay, great. Our trigger is now disabled. Means it will not be fired on the next updates or deletes, etc. So let's now compile our after row trigger and run the update again. As you can see, after row trigger can also see the old and new values of the rows. So that means the values with the old and new qualifiers will be the same with both the before and after row triggers. Do not confuse about that. Some students may think that how can a before statement know the new values? the update or delete etc. has not done yet. Yes, you're right, but to let you use the new values too, Oracle makes the calculations before the row update or insert. So you can get the new value of the columns or assign new values to it easier. You will understand much better while we make more examples. So for now, let's disable that trigger too for the next usages. So let's do that for the before and after statement triggers too. First, let's open up the before statement trigger and work on that. Now let's paste the code that we copied and compile it. As you can see in the compiler log, it says new or old references are not allowed in the table level triggers. Table level triggers mean statement level triggers. Just another word of calling it. So there is no need to try on the after statement trigger. It won't work on that too. But since we compiled that trigger with an error, its status turned to invalid. So let's delete the code we pasted and recompile to make it valid. Great. Now we can test if they will work on the inserts, deletes, etc. But first, let's add delete event on our row level triggers too, so that we can test inserts and deletes consecutively. So let's start doing it with the before row trigger. The only thing to do is writing or delete event text on the events area. Let's write it. Or delete. And compile. Now let's turn back to the worksheet and make a delete. Delete from employees copy. Now let's run it. As you can see in the output, when a delete occurs, row level trigger can reach to the before values, but cannot reach to the after values. Because this is a delete operation and there is no new value. Because the rows are deleted from the database. So no new values of that. And because of that, the new values are null. But do not confuse about that. That does not mean you cannot use new qualifiers in delete events. You can use, no problem on writing it, but the problem is it will always return null in delete events. Alright, so now let's see it with the insert command. Insert into employees copy. Select all the columns from employees. Now let's run it. As you can see, this time the before values are null, but after values exist. The reason is we insert a row, so there is no old value before the insert. But after the insert, there is the new value. Now, let's disable that trigger. And disable that too. And let's do it with the after row trigger. I simply write here or delete and let's compile it. And now let's open up the worksheet again and run the delete command again. As you can see, the same as the before row trigger. So let's run the insert. Yes, this one is also the same as the before row trigger. That means before and after triggers have the same old and new values. No difference on that. The difference is the time they run. On the other hand, with update events, we can reach to the new and old values, but in delete events, we cannot reach to the new values. And in the inserts, we cannot reach to the old values. They are null. Let's commit the changes. Great. Now it's time to show you the referencing old as old and new as new text. You may now say that we have already reached to the old and new values with using a :old and :new prefixes. So why do we need to write them? Yes, you are right. Actually, there is no need to write referencing old as old and new as new text. However, we may want to write different prefixes instead of old and new qualifiers. This is just an option. You don't have to write it. But with this way, you can assign some new aliases for the new and old qualifiers, both or one of them. So you can write your aliases instead of the new and old qualifiers. Actually, I don't use that much, but now I will show you how to use them. So let's open up before row trigger and show on that. One will be enough. You can use this in any type of row level triggers. No difference. So let's open it. Now, I want to warn you about something here. The place of this text is important. I mean, you need to write it before the for each row text. Otherwise, you will have a compilation error. So let's write it then. We write referencing old as O for the new alias of old and new as N for the alias of new qualifier. I simply write referencing old as O and new as N. Great. Now we need to change the new and old qualifiers with their aliases. I write O here and N here and O here. Now let's compile it. Perfect. Now let's test it with the update command. Let's clear up and run the update. As you can see, our before row trigger works perfectly. So we could use the aliases instead of new and old qualifiers with using the referencing clause. By the way, you can use referencing old as alias or referencing new as alias separately. You don't need to write them together. If you set referencing old as O, for example, and do not write anything for the new qualifier, you reach to the old value with using the alias O, and you reach to the new value with using the new qualifier itself. Simply, you can assign aliases for one of them or both. But do not forget, if you assign an alias for the qualifier, you need to use that alias. For example, if you alias new as N, you cannot write new in your code for the qualifier. You will have an error. If you set an alias, you need to use it. If not, you can simply use the old and new qualifiers. Actually, I don't use the referencing clause so much in my work, but you may want to use for a better understanding, etc. It's optional. By the way, sometimes you see some usages like referencing new as new, old as old. But this is not a good way because you can already reach to them without writing the referencing clause. You saw that already. Alright, what we have learned in this lecture. We learned how to reach the old and new values of the rows with using the old and new qualifiers in the row level triggers. And we learned how to give aliases for the old and new qualifiers and use the aliases instead of them. So this is the end of this lecture. See you in the next lectures.